The cry for the right to development by poor countries, for the vast poor, or for a small privileged elite. From the Beijing International Human Rights Forum, examining the distortion of development rights politics and the dilemma of global governance. This is the Jersey News Commentary Channel. From June 11th to 12th, Beijing grandly hosted the so-called Global Forum on Human Rights Governance. The forum centered on the issue of the right to development, emphasizing the idea of promoting human rights through development, while attempting to redefine the global narrative on human rights. On the surface, this appeared to be an international forum filled with idealistic aspirations, poor countries seeking development, weaker nations demanding fairness, and the world striving to narrow the wealth gap. Who could oppose development for impoverished countries? And who would oppose poor people living better lives? The problem is that when the right to development is increasingly packaged by some countries as a political tool, is it truly speaking for the poor, or merely helping a small privileged elite sustain its collective hold on power? Today, this question is no longer merely an academic debate. It has become a real issue concerning the direction of global governance. Beijing Forum, a high-profile showcase of development rights politics. Beijing's hosting of this international forum is by no means merely an ordinary academic exchange. Its true intentions are far more complicated than they appear on the surface. From the design of the topics, to the composition of participating countries, to the language used in official propaganda, everything points toward a clear objective, to rewrite the authority to define human rights. For a long time, the Western-led human rights discourse has emphasized freedom of speech, freedom of the press, rule of law and judicial independence, religious freedom, civil rights, and political participation. What Beijing seeks to promote is another narrative entirely. The right to survival is superior to the right to freedom, and the right to development is superior to political rights. The official rhetoric is very familiar. Without development, there can be no real human rights. At first glance, this sounds reasonable. Yet beneath the surface lies a politically calculated maneuver. There is nothing wrong with development itself. But who gets to define development? Who decides the direction of development on behalf of the people? Who actually shares the major fruits of development? The narrative of development rights promoted by Beijing is, in fact, not merely a discussion about poverty. It is also an effort to build a new kind of international political alliance. Put simply, under the banner of the right to development, Beijing seeks to rally the global South and establish an international narrative distinct from that of the United States and the West. For decades, China has often been placed in the defendant seat of international human rights criticism. Xinjiang, Hong Kong, lawyers' rights defense, freedom of expression, social control. Now, Beijing is no longer satisfied with remaining on the defensive. Instead, it is attempting to transform itself from the criticized party into a rule maker. Its core objective is to compete for the authority to define what human rights are. And the right to development has become the most important political weapon in this struggle over international discourse power. It must be acknowledged, there is nothing wrong with poor countries pursuing development. To deny the legitimacy of the right to development altogether would also be mistaken, because the real hardships faced by many poor countries undeniably exist. After World War II, although countries in Asia, Africa, and Latin America gained independence one after another, many soon discovered that while political independence had been achieved, their economies remained trapped in structures of poverty. What colonialism left behind included single-resource economies, educational deficiencies, technological dependence, financial fragility, and debt traps. Many countries remain stuck in a low-end cycle of selling minerals, agricultural products, and cheap labor. At the same time, international trade rules, technological barriers, and the U.S. dollar-centered financial system have indeed caused many developing countries to feel unfairly treated. Imagine a child who cannot even get enough to eat, a family that has lost access to basic medical care, or a country where massive numbers of young people are unemployed. At such a moment, if the West merely continues repeating, first achieve freedom of the press, many people would naturally ask, if people cannot even fill their stomachs, how can freedom take root? Therefore, there is nothing wrong with poor countries demanding development. The right to development itself is not an original sin. The problem has never been whether development is necessary. The real question is who represents development, who enjoys the benefits of development. In reality, those who loudly advocate for the right to development are often not truly standing with the poor. The China case, how the right to development becomes distorted into political legitimacy. China may be the most typical and also the most controversial case in the world today. Over the past 4 decades, China's economy has grown rapidly, a fact widely acknowledged around the world. High-speed railways, airports, bridges, urban construction, internet industries, manufacturing upgrades. On the surface, China seems to have proven one thing: development can indeed improve people's lives. But the real question is this: is development for the people, or have the people become tools of development? In many ways, China's development logic exhibits a very clear characteristic: the state comes first, not the individual. Economic growth has increasingly been imbued with a kind of political sacredness. GDP has become a measure of political achievement. Infrastructure has become a symbol of glory. Ships, large aircraft, new energy, artificial intelligence, aircraft carriers, warships, and space projects all have become proof of the ruling party's accomplishments. This is not to say these things should not be developed. The real question is, what is the original motivation behind them? Is it truly the serving the people that state media repeatedly proclaims? Is it really the political slogan of putting the people first so frequently repeated in official documents and government work reports? When you turn your gaze toward ordinary society, when you step into urban households burdened by illness and poverty, when you enter remote mountain villages, as long as you still possess even the most basic compassion and sympathy, the shocking poverty you encounter will be difficult to forget. Such groups account for at least more than 30% of the total population. What evidence supports this? Look at several core indicators such as income, consumption, employment, and debt, and the answer becomes clear. Here, let us take monthly median income as a key example. Former Premier Li Keqiang once publicly stated China has 600 million people whose monthly income is less than 1,000 yuan. China Merchants Bank's China Wealth Report, along with Beijing Normal University's Income Stratification Research Report, also pointed out that more than 900 million people in China earn less than 3,000 yuan per month. If in a country, urban and rural residents generally cannot afford medical treatment, cannot afford medicine, and cannot afford hospitalization where medical insurance serves merely as a comforting illusion, if 500 million farmers and elderly people over the age of 70 receive pensions of less than 200 yuan per month, if more than 80% of university graduates are unemployed upon graduation, if crushing mortgage burdens turn hundreds of millions of households into debt slaves, if people long to consume, but their pockets are empty. At the same time, the state continuously pours massive amounts of money into grand projects, shaping a national image, seeking to compete head-on with the United States and the West, spending trillions and trillions at every turn. We cannot help but ask, who truly owns the fruits of China's development? A strange phenomenon has emerged: the state seems to be growing stronger and stronger, while the overwhelming majority of ordinary people at the bottom are becoming poorer, weaker, and increasingly vulnerable. The Chinese Communist Party repeatedly declares that national development exists for the well-being of the people. Yet in the end, it is the people who broadly sacrifice the very interests that should have belonged to them for the sake of national development. More importantly, economic growth has gradually become the core source of political legitimacy. As a result, growth cannot stop, questioning cannot exist, and problems cannot be openly discussed. Because once the myth of growth is shattered, legitimacy loses its shining outer garment. This is why China's GDP supposedly grows at around 5% every year. Yet in reality, such growth has increasingly become a form of political rhetoric and packaging disconnected from facts and disconnected from the lived experiences of ordinary people. As a result, the right to development has long since been distorted. It is no longer a demand raised by the poor. Instead, it has become a political declaration used by authoritarian rulers to prove the legitimacy of their power. America's naivety gives way to awakening. Today, many people criticize America for reversing its attitude toward China, without understanding that this shift has both historical and practical causes. More than 20 years ago, the United States took the lead in supporting China's entry into the WTO. At the time, America's logic was simple: let China become wealthy, and once China becomes wealthy, it will naturally move toward openness and transformation. Washington once believed economic freedom, a growing middle class, the growth of rule of law, political openness. This was an extremely naive wishful thinking embraced by many American politicians. But reality dealt America a loud slap in the face. What America did not anticipate was that China's economic marketization and political centralization would occur almost simultaneously. China not only failed to move toward openness, but in many areas actually strengthened political control. As manufacturing and technological capabilities upgraded, China's military-industrial power accelerated its expansion. During the Xi Jinping era, China launched the Belt and Road Initiative, on one hand, while on the other hand drawing closer to Russia, Iran, North Korea, and other authoritarian states, forming increasingly close strategic alignments. China's ambition for international dominance has grown day by day, while its wolf warrior diplomacy has become increasingly aggressive and unconstrained. It was precisely under these circumstances that the United States finally woke up and began realizing it had been deceived. This is why today there are measures such as chip restrictions, supply chain restructuring, de-risking strategies, and other increasingly unfriendly policies. At its core, America no longer believes that economic openness will inevitably lead to political openness. In a certain sense, the China model has completely shattered the myth America once created for itself, the belief that development automatically leads to freedom. A global dilemma: what should be done? So here comes the question, what should the world do? If the world abandons helping poor countries, poverty will worsen, instability will escalate, refugee flows will increase, and conflicts may intensify. But if unconditional aid continues, it may instead fatten authoritarian regimes and military governments, fueling dynastic rule and corrupt bureaucracies. As a result, the world has fallen into a profound dilemma. If we do not help, the vast poor suffer. If we do help, the benefits may be swallowed for generations by a small privileged elite. So what should be done? In my view, abandoning development altogether is also not a viable option. What we need instead is to redefine development. First, shift from supporting governments to supporting societies. Aid should flow more toward education, healthcare, grassroots governance, women's education, and civil society organizations, while also establishing strict systems of supervision and accountability rather than directly transfusing resources into the hands of ruling authorities. Second, make development assistance transparent. Development aid funds should be tied to mechanisms involving anti-corruption measures, fiscal transparency, and progress in legal and institutional reform. Third, international institutions themselves must reform. Today, the credibility and influence of many international organizations are steadily declining. Political hijacking, ideological confrontation, and blurred accountability have caused many institutions to drift away from their original missions, leaving donor countries deeply disappointed and sometimes even angry. The purpose of international organizations should be to help the truly vulnerable, not to become amplifiers of geopolitical struggles, nor to be hijacked by a handful of countries under the banner of humanitarianism and development. Fourth, rebalance the relationship between development and freedom. True human rights should not mean having freedom without food to eat. Nor should they mean having development without dignity. Because development must not devour freedom, and freedom must not ignore poverty. Who truly speaks for the poor? When the poor cry out, "We want development," the world should certainly listen. But the real question is, who is speaking on behalf of the poor? Very often, those who claim to speak for the poor do not truly represent them. What they represent is not the hut, but the palace, not people's livelihood, but power, not the future of ordinary citizens, but the continuation of political rule. When the right to development ultimately degenerates into a resource used by a small privileged elite to maintain control, when it becomes a justification for strengthening power and prolonging authoritarian rule, then it no longer speaks for poor countries, or poor people. Instead, it becomes a new form of political deception. That is the warning this Beijing International Human Rights Forum offers us.